Hello. Welcome to First Look. I'm back. Whether that's a good thing or not for you, it is what it is. I had a lovely time. My family and I had a lovely time this past week on vacation, and so I'm sure I'll tell you about that here sometime soon. But it's good to be back and good to kind of have I'm having all that re-entry stuff where you're trying to catch up to what on earth is happening and where you're going and what's next and all that kind of stuff. So what I like about this is that this kind of makes me feel like I get to sort of turn the page and I'm really back into the thick of what I'm doing whenever I do this. So thanks for doing that with me. And as I am recording this, I still need to watch or review or worship and listen to Brian Wallace's sermon. But knowing Brian and knowing who he is and what he brings, I have full confidence that it was wonderful and that you all had just a blessed time together. So I'm really glad for that. And I'm also glad that he was able to continue this little series that we have here moving forward in the month of August, continuing to look at the book of Ephesians. And as I'm recording this, I haven't looked at anything at all. While I was gone, I didn't prepare for this coming Sunday. So as I read it to you here in a few minutes, that will literally be the first time I'm reading it. And so I'll give you the first thoughts, and then whatever I write for Sunday will be based on, what I do and how I spend my time over the next couple of days. But that re-entry time is always busy. So where we left off was, at least in terms of what I was doing, was just kind of giving you an introduction into who the Ephesians are. And I think one of the things that I always try to remember is that, any pastor or 99.5% of pastors are not experts from the an academic standpoint, are not experts in any one particular part of the Bible. We get pretty good at reading the Bible. I think we can get pretty good at interpreting the Bible, communicating the Bible. But in terms of the historical sense of a place, I can give you what I can research, but I haven't been to Ephesus. I haven't been to the ruins. I haven't, spent semesters just thinking about and talking about Ephesus. What I can give you is, what I have in my library, or what research I've done myself, or my understanding of not just what was happening in Ephesus, but was happening, throughout the Roman world at the time. And most of that is from a biblical perspective, meaning most of my source material, not all of it, but most of it, is the Bible, which is not is historical, but is not meant to be primarily a historical document. So occasionally I do bring in things, encyclopedias or other things that I can learn about a place. But most of what I try to do with you is to give you a sense of what does Scripture say about this place, and how does that influence our interpretation of it. So I'm not trying to be a historian from that standpoint, but my perspective is to say, this is what Paul thought. This is what at least my interpretation of what Paul thought about this place. This is what he wrote. This is what he had to say. This is what the book of Acts, Luke, the author of Acts, has to say about Ephesus, what was happening at the time. And so since we're looking at this from a faith perspective, most of what I tell you is also from a faith perspective. For instance, if you were looking at like the Babylonians, or you were looking at the Persians, okay, those groups of people. Whenever I talk about Babylon or whenever I talk about Persia, it's usually, of course, from a faith perspective. This is how they were perceived from a biblical perspective. If you talk to a historian, they're going to give you another perspective, right? And that would be important for you to gain also. I think one of the things that's important for us is to try to get that kind of way of looking at those different eras of time, because they give us a much more well-rounded way of understanding it. We often think of people, hey, if you did something bad to Israel, then you are the villain in the story. But if you were looking at it from a global historical perspective, Babylon, the Persian Empire, they're going to talk about that from a very different perspective. And so my point in saying any of this is that as I look at Ephesus, or if you research something about it, or you read an article about it, or many of you I know are people who subscribe to things like those biblical archaeology magazines, or something in National Geographic. They may give you a layered perspective, and that's wonderful. And so let me encourage you to do that. And if you find anything that that spoke to you, as I'm preaching, whether it's Ephesus or whether it's Galilee or any other area, Babylon or Persia or any of those places or any of those empires that we might talk about, I always gain something from that. I always appreciate the fact that you all are willing to dive in with those things for me. There's someone who sends me articles about translation, like how we translate different words. One of you does that, and I always find it fascinating and really helpful. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of plug that and thank you for being those people. So this passage that we're going to look at from Ephesians, let me just kind of remind you of, I guess you could say, what am I trying to accomplish in all of this? The Ephesians is one of those things that what I was trying to say before is a letter that's focused on not just our corporate interactions with each other, not just our, how do we function as society? How do we relate to each other whenever we go through differences? But also talks about that a lot from a one-on-one perspective. How do I relate to the other person in front of me personally? And I think Ephesians is a great letter for that. And what I tried to talk about 2 weeks ago was how we see that played out in the book of Ephesians, and some of the reasons why. Because I looked at the book of Acts and I looked at Paul's time in Ephesus and try to kind of draw that in. So we do look at this. There are some letters that we look at from a more like congregational, societal perspective. But other ones like Ephesians, I would encourage you to look at it from that perspective, but to also look at it from a more one-on-one perspective, because I think that's the way that it approaches interaction. Because there are obviously letters of Paul that look at right theology, right? If you look at like the book of Romans, it's looking at how do I understand who Jesus is theologically. And then you look at a book like the letters to the Corinthians. They deal with a lot more of the corporate stuff, like how do we interact, together. Some letters, like Galatians, try to tell people more about how to be more accepting of people. That's the slant. And so they all have kind of a different way of trying to approach the issues that the church deals with. And all of that depends on the place. So what we have here, I think, again, this is my interpretation of it, is a way for us to understand how we relate to each other on a more individual basis. How we relate to each other on an individual basis always has influence on how we relate to each other corporately, but I think that's the emphasis. So here we're in chapter 5, and we're looking at a snippet here, 15 through 20. That's the text for this week. So Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 20. And I'm going to read this to you for the first time. I've read it before, but you know what I mean. I haven't read it in a while. So I'm going to read this here with you. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time, because the days are evil. So do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And then give some examples. Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs among yourselves, singing and making melody to the Lord in your hearts, giving thanks to God the Father at all times and for everything in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, some of the obvious elements to that are trying to kind of talk about a sense of how we should act, right? How we should spend our time. And, I think that trying to make this passage about, alcohol or, talking about that kind of thing is sort of missing the forest for the trees. That's a good lesson, and that's something for us to think about and to talk about. But it's an example of a kind of distraction, or a kind of what can tend to take us away from who we are meant to be as people of faith. So I think that you see there in the in that little text is a way for us to kind of understand how to approach the lens through which to approach life. Not so much that, we take that literally in the sense that we spend our day just listening to hymns. That's not the point. That misses the forest for the trees. But it's trying to set up something where we understand the lens or the prism through which to understand the world. And, and that's, as an important kind of thing to remind ourselves as we possibly can. And I think that there's a couple of ways that come to mind as I think about that. So first, I think that part of what Paul is dealing with in this particular passage are people who are trying to come to terms with what it means to be a follower of Jesus specifically. And lots of different religions, of course, have, both at the time and today, have warnings about worldly distractions or over-consuming, whether we're talking about substances, whether we're talking about food, whether we're talking about relationships, whether we're talking about monetary things, overconsumption of those kind of things, this story could just as easily not said something about alcohol, but could have talked about food or money or anything. And so I think that Paul is trying to lay the groundwork for what does it mean to live this faith out day by day. And some of that is about Christianity not being an intellectual exercise. Now that's important for you and I, because we can make our faith an intellectual exercise very easily. But it also would have been very important, as you would imagine, in the world that the people of Ephesus occupied. Because a lot of different religious thought, right? A lot of kind of pluralism when it comes to what that looks like. Christianity wasn't just something that like you could add into your, or fold into who you already are. Paul is trying to say, look, this is not just something that you sign on to in terms of how you think or feel, but it's really about what you live all the time and what you allow to be a part of your life, what you lean on, and that's going to look differently for everybody, obviously. But it needs to be a lived experience, not just a kind of mental experience, right? This isn't just I believe, I accept, I think something. But I feel, I experience, I live something, right? That's what he's trying to say. So I think the first part is trying to draw some sort of definition around what does it mean for the people who are there to live and experience Jesus. And that needs to be something that's more than just a box to check off. But then I think that part of the other, I guess, element of the lesson that I think is important is giving people a sense of how to make that practice feasible. And I think that's the part that, at least for me, is important. At least maybe just this week or the way I'm thinking about it now. I think to make something a lived experience, I think comes with, is relational. Meaning that part of the lived experience, part of saying, this is my faith and this is who I am and this is what I think. Part of the lived experience isn't just how you kind of drape yourself in Christian elements of life, right? It's not just actions like, praying before a meal or, talking about your faith or, surrounding yourself with like going to church really often or listening to hymns, during the day. I don't think Paul is advocating for us just to kind of immerse ourselves in something that's cultural. Like I'm involved in the culture of church. And I think that can be that can be a crutch too. The intellectualism of faith can be a crutch, like, oh, well, I think all the right things, so I must be on the right path, or I'm doing this right. There's that element, but there's also this like, oh, well, I'm active in all the right things. I don't listen to this kind of music, I only listen to this kind of music. I don't watch these kind of movies, I only watch these kind of movies. My clothing has this on it, or I put this up in my house, or I put that up in my house. That's all well and good and fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's your prerogative. But there's also some sense of this being relational. And I think that, that's the part that we mention all the time, because it's the part that we do the least well consistently. Because we do, and it's certainly in a, either in an election year, we think about these types of things, or anytime we think about the state of the world, or the state of each other, or the state of the church, or any times when we're actively reflecting on what's happening around us, what will change, what could change, how are we as a community, or as a nation, or as a world how are we defining ourselves? Anytime we actively participate in working that out, and we, like I said, there are times that we do that more than others. Part of what we have to remember is that whatever we think, or whatever we say we care about, or however we approach, wanting the world to be different, or the world to change, or whatever, we have to emphasize for ourselves over and over again, what does it mean for us to seek meaningful, empathetic relationships with other people? Because as we work that out, again, whether we're talking about our church, division within our country, division within our world, and as we kind of work on that, it's not just an intellectual work or exercise where you believe that and I believe this, and you stand on that side of the aisle and I stand over on this side of the aisle. But it's also not something where you believe that and I believe this, and we never engage each other, right? We just ignore it because we do that too often. That's not the kind of engagement that I think we're asked to be a part of either. And we don't just put ourselves in a place where we only surround ourselves with people that agree with us, right? That kind of silo thinking where I only am engaged with, or I only care about people who think like me, or see the world like I do. But we try to look at genuine engagement in a way that expresses empathy and care for other people. And I know that I say that and you kind of nod along, like, yeah, well, of course that's what we should do. We should be engaging each other with empathy and compassion. We don't very often. Or we do by caring about the person in front of us while never really knowing how to engage the parts of us that are different in a healthy way, right? I think you probably know this to be true. The amount of people in your life that know how to engage people in healthy, constructive ways can sometimes feel very limited. Even with people who are are very intellectual people, or very otherwise very aware of the world and successful or whatever. That kind of emotional intelligence and empathy and compassion and listening is rarer than I think we'd like to admit, even with people that we like, or even people that we love, or even within ourselves. And I think that's one of the things that for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about in that kind of practice what you preach kind of way. And to circle this back to what I think Paul is talking about, he's trying to encourage people to not just intellectualize something, or not just engulf themselves in something, but to really actively learn what it means to live it, to talk about it. But not just to have those conversations, but to say, how do we get to someplace better? It's not just me convincing you that you're wrong, or you convincing me that I'm wrong, but it's about trying to understand, like, hey, if there are two sides to this, whatever this is, do we both want the same thing, or do we not want the same thing? And I think we've talked about societal differences with more optimism than maybe we should have. And what I mean by that is, we have often talked about politics. I'm talking about, it's an election year, so this is the kind of thing that's on your mind. We talk about politics and we talk about the state of the world often like, oh, well, we all want the same thing. We just want it from we come at it from different perspectives. Whatever issue it is we're talking about. And sometimes that's true. But I think what I have found over time is that sometimes that's really not true. What you want for the world and what I want for the world is sometimes very, very different. And, and that shouldn't be overlooked. Sometimes it is very, very much the same. I want to be safe and you want to be safe. I want to care about people and you want to care about people. I want everyone to have what they need and you want everyone to have what they need. You want to be left to your own devices in terms of making, decisions for your life, and so do I, right? Like, we kind of want the same things. We want other people to have, safety and belonging and whatever. We want that for other people. It's the times that we actually don't want the same things that I think are really hard. Hey, that over there, what should happen? Oh, this should happen. No, it shouldn't. Like, that's, whatever happens to be. And I think that's the hardest part for me, is coming to terms with not just that our march up the mountain comes at something from different perspectives and we have to learn how to work together, in order to make that happen. But what do we do when we adamantly want different things, adamantly see our neighbor completely differently? They are something else to you than they are to me. That's where life gets hard. And I think that's the part that we far too often don't know how to kind of grapple with. And if I had a really good answer to that, I would be I'd be a much more accomplished author than I am. But that kind of is what this passage led me to think, because I looked at it 5 minutes ago, so I had a lot of time to think about it. But that was what it kind of drew me to today, was how do we find these kind of genuine ways of understanding each other, and what do we do when we honestly don't see solutions the same way? That's tough. What is the faithful response when that's true? Not just that we have two different ways of going about the same thing, but we have two different ways, and what we want in the end are completely different. That's where the rubber hits the road for me. That's what I got. I'm over time today, so I apologize about that. I kind of talked a little bit longer than I realized I would, but it is what it is. I assume that you fast forward through these things. Why wouldn't you? I appreciate you. I appreciate the time. Thanks for continuing to think about this with me. I hope it's helpful. And if it's not, I hope that you can have a good rest of your day without thinking about it again. So I'm looking forward to this Sunday. I hope that you have a wonderful day. If you need something, please let me know. And I look forward to doing this again with you for another First Look. So until then, take care.